There is a place in the high desert of Eastern California where the wind still moves through empty doorways, where a bank vault sits open and rusted in a building with no roof, and where more than 170 structures stand exactly as they were left, down to the dishes on the shelves and the goods still stacked on store counters. No one lives there. No one has lived there in decades, and yet nothing has been cleared away. It is as if an entire town, at the height of its wealth and ambition, simply stopped breathing all at once, and the desert agreed to hold its breath along with it. This is the story of America's abandoned mining camps, the ghost towns scattered across the mountains and deserts of the West, where the promise of instant fortune once pulled tens of thousands of ordinary people out of their old lives and into a gamble against the earth itself. It is a story of astonishing wealth pulled from solid rock, of towns that rose in a matter of months and housed thousands of souls, and of the strange, sudden silence that followed when the gold and silver ran out. To understand how a place can be born screaming with ambition and then abandoned so completely that a coffee cup is left mid-pour on a table, we have to go back to the moment America first learned that the ground beneath its feet could make a person rich beyond imagining. The year was 1848, and the place was a modest sawmill on the American River in the foothills of California, owned by a Swiss immigrant named John Sutter. A carpenter working for him, James Marshall, noticed something glinting in the tail race of the mill. Small flakes of a soft yellow metal that did not behave like anything else in the riverbed. Marshall bit it, hammered it, and finally confirmed what his instincts already suspected. It was gold. Sutter tried desperately to keep the discovery quiet, fearing it would destroy the agricultural community he was building. But secrets like this do not stay buried. Within months, the news had reached San Francisco, and within a year, it had reached the entire world. Ships altered their courses. Farmers dropped their plows mid-furrow. Sailors abandoned their vessels in San Francisco Bay so completely that the harbor filled with hundreds of deserted ships. Their crews vanished into the hills in search of gold. By 1849, an estimated 300,000 people had poured into California from every corner of the globe, and the mining camp was born as a distinctly American institution, a settlement thrown together almost overnight, built not for permanence, but for extraction, existing only as long as the ground beneath it had something left to give. These camps did not look like the towns most of the newcomers had left behind. There were no zoning boards, no city planners, no churches built first and streets laid out around them. A mining camp began the moment enough men pitched tents near a promising strike, and it grew in whatever direction commerce demanded. Canvas structures gave way to rough plank buildings as sawmills were hauled in. Saloons appeared before schools. General stores stocked with flour, whiskey, boots, and mining tools charged prices that would have been considered highway robbery anywhere else, because in a place with no roads and no railroad, every nail and every can of beans had to be hauled in by mule or wagon over brutal terrain. A camp with a few hundred residents in January might have several thousand by summer, and a town that had never existed on any map could, within 2 years, boast its own newspaper, its own theater, its own volunteer fire company, and its own cemetery filling faster than anyone wanted to admit. Life inside these camps was defined by contradiction. Fortunes were made and lost within days. A man might pull several $1,000s worth of gold from a single claim in a week, an almost incomprehensible sum for the era, and then lose it just as quickly at a card table or to a claim jumper with a faster gun. Disease moved through the crowded, unsanitary camps with terrifying speed, and dysentery, cholera, and pneumonia
killed far more miners than any gunfight ever did. Winters in the Sierra Nevada or the Rocky Mountains could bury a camp under snow for months, cutting off supply lines and leaving communities to survive on whatever they had managed to store away. And yet, the miners kept coming, driven by a peculiarly American belief that the next shovelful of dirt, the next mile of creek bed, the next mountain over might hold the fortune that had eluded them so far. California's gold rush was only the beginning. As the easily panned surface gold became harder to find, prospectors fanned outward across the West, chasing rumors and geological hunches into Nevada, Colorado, Montana, Arizona, and the Dakota Territory. In 1859, prospectors working the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada in Nevada stumbled onto something that would prove even more valuable than California's gold, a massive deposit of silver ore known as the Comstock Lode. The town that grew up around it, Virginia City, became one of the richest mining settlements in American history, and the wealth extracted from beneath its streets helped finance the Union War. Effort during the Civil War, and turned San Francisco into a genuine metropolis almost overnight. Virginia City had gas lighting, an opera house, and a stock exchange, while many older American cities were still lit by candles. It was the mining camp at its most extreme, a place where fortunes, so vast they altered national history, could be pulled from a single mountainside. Not every camp reached such heights, and most burned far shorter and dimmer. In the high desert of California's Mono County, a camp called Bodie began as a small and unremarkable strike in 1859, named for a prospector who died in a blizzard before he ever saw the town that would bear his name. For nearly 2 decades, Bodie remained a minor operation, but in 1876, a mine collapse exposed a rich body of gold ore, and everything changed. Word spread, and by the early 1880s, Bodie had exploded into a town of nearly 10,000 people, with claims to be one of the most lawless and violent settlements in the American West. Newspapers of the era reported that the town averaged nearly 1 killing a day during its roughest stretches, the product of gunfights, robberies, and the volatile mixture of easy money, hard liquor, and desperate men far from any real law enforcement. Bodie had dozens of saloons lining its main street, along with brothels, gambling halls, and a red light district that operated openly. Children in Bodie reportedly prayed each night, not for their own safety, but that no one else would be shot before morning, a detail that has survived in local lore as a chilling snapshot of what daily life in a boomtown could feel like. But the very thing that built Bodie also destroyed it. Gold mining is fundamentally an act of subtraction. Every ton of ore removed from a vein brings a town closer to the moment when there is nothing left to remove. By the mid-1880s, the richest deposits around Bodie had been exhausted, and newer, more promising strikes elsewhere began pulling miners away. The population that had swelled past 10,000 fell into the hundreds within a few years. A fire tore through part of the business district in 1892, and residents, no longer invested in a dying town, did not bother to rebuild much of what burned. By the early 20th century, Bodie was a shadow of its former self, home to only a handful of stubborn residents. A second major fire in 1932, allegedly started by a young boy playing with matches near an outhouse, destroyed nearly all of what remained of the commercial district. The last mining operations shut down for good in the 1940s, and by then, Bodie had become something almost unheard of in American history, a town that died slowly enough and remotely enough that no one ever came to tear it down or build something new on top of it. It simply stood there, empty, while the dry desert air preserved it in a strange kind of suspended animation. Today, Bodie is maintained by the state of California in a condition its caretakers call arrested decay, meaning buildings are stabilized just enough to prevent total collapse, but never restored or altered. Visitors can press their faces against dusty windows and see pool tables still standing, church pews still in rows, and store shelves still stocked with goods that have not moved in nearly a century.
Bodie's story, dramatic as it is, was repeated in various forms across the mining West, and each abandoned camp carries its own particular flavor of that same rise and collapse. In Montana, the town of Bannack sprang up after gold was discovered along Grasshopper Creek in 1862, and it briefly became the territorial capital, complete with its own notorious and corrupt sheriff, Henry Plummer, who was secretly believed by many residents to be leading the very gang of road agents terrorizing miners along the region's trails. Vigilante justice, swift and often brutal, became the community's answer to lawlessness, and Plummer himself was eventually hanged by a vigilance committee in 1864, one of the more startling episodes of frontier self-governance in American history. Bannack's gold eventually thinned, its residents drifted toward richer strikes, and the town slowly emptied until it too became a preserved ghost town, its wooden buildings leaning at odd angles against the Montana sky.
Further south, in the Nevada desert near Death Valley, a camp called Rhyolite tells an even stranger and more compressed version of the boom and bust cycle. Gold was discovered there in 1904, and within just a few years, Rhyolite had transformed from an empty stretch of desert into a genuine city of an estimated 10,000 residents, complete with electric lights, a stock exchange, a hospital, a school, concrete sidewalks, and even a train depot built in a grand Spanish mission style. Investors poured money into Rhyolite with astonishing confidence, convinced they were building the next great mining metropolis of the West. But the underlying ore was not nearly as rich as early assays had suggested, and when the financial panic of 1907 swept through American markets, credit dried up and investment fled. Mines closed. The population collapsed almost as fast as it had risen. By 1920, the federal census recorded only a handful of residents left in a town that a decade earlier had boasted its own opera house. Rhyolite stands today as perhaps the most extreme example of how quickly the mining boom could invert itself, a skeleton city built for permanence that lasted barely more than a single decade.
Alaska offers a different and later chapter in this same American story. In the remote Wrangell Mountains, a copper deposit of extraordinary purity was discovered in the early 1900s, and the mining company that developed it built an entire company town called Kennecott to support the operation. Unlike the freewheeling gold camps of the previous century, Kennecott was a carefully planned and thoroughly corporate settlement, with a general store, a hospital, a school, and a recreation hall, all owned and operated by the mining company itself, its buildings painted a distinctive red trimmed in white that still stands out starkly against the glacier-carved landscape today. For nearly 3 decades, Kennecott shipped enormous quantities of high-grade copper ore out by railroad, but by the late 1930s, the richest veins had been depleted, and the company made the decision to shut the entire operation down. What makes Kennecott's abandonment so unusual is its abruptness. The company gave workers notice. The last train left in November of 1938, and the town was essentially locked up and walked away from all at once, rather than fading gradually like Bodie or Rhyolite. Machinery was left in place. Personal belongings were left on shelves. It was less a slow decline than a single, deliberate exit. And the remoteness of the Wrangell Mountains meant that almost nothing was ever hauled back out or looted in the decades that followed.
Across all these towns, certain patterns repeat themselves with an almost eerie consistency.
and understanding them helps explain why America's mining frontier produced so many of these frozen-in-time settlements, rather than towns that simply evolved into modern cities. Mining camps were built around a resource that was, by definition, finite and unpredictable. Unlike agricultural towns, which could adapt to changing markets by planting different crops, or trading towns, which could pivot to different goods, a mining camp's entire existence depended on a vein of ore that geology had placed in a specific spot in a specific quantity. And that quantity was always, eventually, going to run out. When it did, there was rarely a secondary industry to fall back to.
Many of these camps sat in locations chosen purely for their proximity to ore deposits, not for fertile soil, reliable water, or convenient trade routes, meaning that once the mining stopped, there was often no economic reason for anyone to remain at all. Combine that with the remoteness of much of the American West, and you get a recipe for abandonment rather than gradual repurposing. A dying industrial town in the East might slowly convert its mills into something else and retain much of its population. A dying mining camp in the Nevada desert, 2 days hard travel from the nearest railhead, simply emptied because there was nothing left to convert to and nowhere nearby that made staying practical.
The speed of that emptying is part of what makes these places feel so strange to modern visitors. In most historical ruins, whether ancient or recent, the passage of time is visible in layers, in the slow accumulation and stripping away of use. But in a place like Bodie, the departure was fast enough and the isolation total enough that almost nothing was carried away. Furniture stayed in houses because moving it across hundreds of miles of desert simply was not worth the cost compared to buying new furniture wherever the family resettled. Store inventory stayed on shelves because there was no longer a customer base to sell it to and no economical way to transport it elsewhere. Even personal letters, photographs, and children's toys were sometimes left behind, not out of any dramatic tragedy, but out of the simple mathematics of what was and was not worth hauling over rough terrain by wagon or early automobile. The result, decades later, is a kind of accidental time capsule, not curated by any museum, but preserved by pure economic circumstance and the dry climate of the American interior, which slows decay in a way that a humid eastern forest never could.
There is also a deeper cultural story woven into these abandoned camps, one that speaks to something particular about the American frontier experience. The mining rush was, in many ways, a distillation of the broader promise that drew immigrants and restless citizens westward throughout the 19th century. The idea that ordinary people, through grit and luck rather than inherited privilege, could strike it rich and remake their entire lives in the span of a single season. That promise pulled in Chinese immigrants who built entire supporting communities around the camps despite facing brutal discrimination and violence. Cornish miners who brought centuries of European hard rock mining expertise to bear on American ore bodies. Formerly enslaved people seeking new opportunity in the years after the Civil War, and countless others who saw in the mining frontier a chance that older, more settled parts of the country simply did not offer. The camps were, in that sense, remarkably diverse and remarkably temporary communities, all at once. Places where a person's past mattered less than what they could pull out of the ground today, and where an entire social order could form and dissolve within the space of a single decade. By the early 20th century, the character of American mining itself had begun to shift in ways that made these boom and bust camps less common. Large corporations increasingly replaced individual prospectors, bringing industrial-scale equipment capable of processing lower-grade ore profitably, which extended some mining towns' lifespans considerably, but also concentrated ownership and wealth
in ways the earlier, scrappier camps never had. The romantic image of the lone prospector with a mule and a gold pan gradually gave way to company towns like Kennecott, run by corporate management rather than emerging organically from the chaos of a rush. And as
railroads expanded and automobiles made travel easier, some towns that would once have simply vanished managed to find new economic footing in ranching, tourism, or other industries, avoiding the complete abandonment that claimed so many of their predecessors. Today, scattered across Nevada, California, Montana, Colorado, Arizona, and Alaska, these ghost towns exist in varying states of preservation and decay, some maintained as state parks, some crumbling quietly on private or federal land far from any road, and some reduced to little more than scattered foundations and mine tailings, barely distinguishable from the surrounding landscape. They draw historians, photographers, and curious travelers who walk their empty streets, trying to imagine the noise and motion that once filled them. The clatter of stamp mills crushing ore around the clock, the shouts of teamsters driving wagons loaded with supplies, the music spilling out of saloons late into desert nights. It is a strange kind of quiet that settles over these places now, a quiet that feels less like emptiness and more like a held breath, as though the towns are simply waiting, the way they always waited, for the next rumor of gold to come drifting up the canyon and bring them roaring back to life one more time. That rumor never came again, not in the way it once had, and so these camps remain exactly as the mining frontier left them. Monuments not to a war or a disaster, but to a particular and uniquely American kind of hope. The belief that the ground itself might hold the answer to a better life, and the willingness to build an entire world around that belief, however briefly the world was destined to last. What remains today is not simply a collection of empty buildings in the desert. It is the physical residue of thousands of individual dreams, each one arriving with the same fragile hope, and each one, in the end, dissolving quietly back into the silence of the American West.